They say in Halifax, you never make eye contact with a man who arrives in a convoy of black vehicles. But what if that man walks into your hospital ward holding the hand of the small, hollow-eyed boy you've been sneaking extra pudding cups to for the past 6 weeks? Sloane Merritt was just a night shift care aide at Harbour View General, working double shifts to keep her younger brother out of the kind of trouble that put boys like him in the ground before 30. She thought she was just being decent to a sad little kid. She didn't know that a single chocolate pudding cup would rewrite every plan she had ever made for her life. The 3rd floor of Harbour View at 11 p.m. smelled the way all hospitals smell after visiting hours: antiseptic, cold coffee, and the faint sweetness of something medicinal that never quite left the air. Sloane had stopped noticing it 2 years ago. She moved through the corridor in rubber-soled shoes, her dark hair pulled into a knot at the back of her neck, her scrubs already bearing a faint smudge of something she chose not to examine closely on the left sleeve. The station was quiet. Quiet was good. Quiet meant the patients were sleeping, and sleeping meant she could finish her charting before the 4 a.m. medication round without running. She was halfway through a progress note when she heard it. Not crying, exactly. Something more restrained than that. A small, choked sound coming from room 317. She looked up. The man assigned to sit outside 317, not a hospital volunteer, not a family member, but a man who had the particular stillness of someone paid to be present and intimidating, was asleep in his chair, chin dropped to his chest, one thick hand still curled around his phone. Sloane pushed open the door to 317. The boy inside was 7 years old, according to his chart. His name was listed as Theo, no surname recorded on admission, which had struck every nurse on the floor as unusual, but which nobody had pushed hard enough to question. He had been brought in 6 weeks ago with a severe respiratory infection, and what the attending physician had quietly noted as signs of prolonged psychological stress. He had not spoken to a single member of the medical team since arrival. He communicated in nods and, occasionally, in small pencil drawings left on his meal tray. He was sitting upright in bed now, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the window. The city lights of Halifax blurred orange and white through the rain on the glass. His eyes, which were a very dark grey, were dry. He wasn't the kind of child who cried loudly. He was the kind who had learned that crying didn't help. "Hey," Sloane said softly, stepping in and letting the door close behind her. "Can't sleep?" Theo looked at her. He shook his head once, very slightly. "Me neither, most nights," she said. She walked to the foot of his bed and straightened his blanket in the automatic way of someone who has done it 1,000 times. "You want some water or?" She paused. "I may or may not have a contraband pudding cup in my left pocket." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite a smile, but the tightness around his mouth eased by a fraction. She pulled out the small plastic cup. Chocolate, the good kind. Not the chalky institutional brand. She'd started bringing them from the 24-hour grocery, 3 blocks away on her way into work. 5 weeks ago, she had told herself it was a one-time thing. Sloane sat in the chair beside his bed and watched him eat the pudding with the focused gravity of a child who was not taking small pleasures for granted. She didn't ask him questions. She had learned in the first week that questions made him pull inward like a sea creature retreating into its shell. She just sat with him, the way her mother had once sat with her during the bad years, present and quiet and unhurried. When the cup was empty, he reached under his pillow and drew out a folded piece of paper. He smoothed it out on the bed and pushed it toward her. It was a drawing in pencil. A woman with a messy bun, clearly meant to be Sloane, standing beside a small figure in a hospital bed. Between them, he had drawn what was unmistakably a pudding cup, surrounded by small, careful lines that were probably meant to suggest it was glowing or important, or both. Underneath, in the large, still imprecise letters of a 7-year-old, he had written, "You are nice." Sloane folded the drawing and tucked it into her pocket. Her throat felt the way it sometimes did at the end of a very long shift. "So are you," she said. "Get some sleep, okay? I'll check on you at 4. He nodded and lay back down, pulling the blanket to his chin with both hands. His eyes followed her to the door with an expression she had no good word for. Not hope exactly, something more careful than hope, something that had been hurt into cautiousness. She checked on him again at 4, and at 6:15, and she found herself thinking about him on the bus home, in the grey Halifax morning, which was new. She had built her career around professional distance. It was the only sustainable way to do the job. You cared appropriately, and then you left it at the hospital, because if you carried every patient home with you, you wouldn't last 2 years in this work. But Theo was different in a way she couldn't resolve into a clean principle. 3 weeks after the pudding cup drawing. The thing happened, it was a Thursday, and the floor was short-staffed because 2 aides had called in sick with what was going around. Sloane was covering rooms she didn't normally take. She was moving fast and running behind, and she came around the corner near 317 to find the guard outside the room. A different one, today younger, with a jaw like a shovel on his feet, looming over the doorway and talking loudly into his phone. She couldn't hear the content, but the volume was wrong for a hospital corridor. The tone was wrong. She slowed. Through the small window in the door, she could see Theo. He was on his feet beside the bed, which he was not supposed to be, not without assistance. His lungs were still recovering. And he had backed himself against the wall by the window. His face was a mask of the specific blank terror that Sloane had learned to read as worse than visible distress, because it meant a child had long ago stopped believing that showing distress would bring help. The guard had clearly said something through the door, or the phone call had carried, and whatever it was had frightened the boy badly. Sloane did not think. This was important. She did not think. She thought about it later, lying awake at 2 in the morning in her apartment in Dartmouth, and what she understood was that some decisions come from somewhere beneath the reach of reason. She pushed the door open, walked past the guard without looking at him, crossed the room, and crouched in front of Theo. "Hey," she said quietly. "Come sit down. It's okay." He came to her immediately, which broke her heart in the specific way things break when trust is given by someone who has very good reasons not to trust. She had just helped him back onto the bed when the guard pushed into the room. He was not a large man, but he carried his authority the way some men do, like something that had never been questioned and therefore felt to him, like a natural law. "You need to step out," he said to Sloane. "This isn't your patient." "He is on my floor," Sloane said. She kept her voice level. "And he's a pediatric respiratory patient who should not be standing unassisted. Is there a problem I should be documenting?" The guard looked at her. She looked back. She was 29 years old, and she had worked night shift in a Halifax hospital for 4 years, and she had looked at harder men than this one and not flinched. He stepped back out of the room. Sloane stayed with Theo for 11 minutes. She pulled the chair up close and talked quietly about nothing important, about the rain, about a seagull she had seen on the roof across the street, about how the cafeteria had reportedly gotten a new coffee machine that was already broken again. Theo said nothing, but by the time she stood up to go, his hands were no longer pressed flat against his thighs. At the door, she looked back. He raised one hand slightly, not quite a wave, just an acknowledgement. She did not know what was coming. She had no way to know. 40 minutes later, she was at the nursing station when the elevator opened. The floor went quiet in the way it does sometimes when something changes in the air pressure of a room. Not dramatically, just a subtle recalibration of attention, the way a group of people responds to something that doesn't quite fit the established pattern of the environment. 4 men stepped out. They were wearing dark clothing that had nothing to do with the hospital. Behind them came a 5th man. He was tall, somewhere in his early 40s, with dark hair going silver at the sides, and the kind of posture that suggested he had never once in his life been uncertain about whether he had the right to be somewhere. He was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than Sloane's monthly rent, and he moved through the corridor with the unhurried, consuming attention of a man who was assessing everything and filing it away simultaneously. Behind him, carrying a leather briefcase, was a younger man Sloane recognized. It took her a moment. The junior physician who had consulted on Theo's case 3 weeks ago, Dr. Harlan, who had asked unusually specific questions about visitor access protocols and then left without writing any notes. The man in the charcoal suit stopped at the nursing station. He looked at the charge nurse, whose name was Bettina, and who had 22 years of experience and could handle a code situation without raising her voice. And Bettina looked back at him and visibly recalibrated. "I'm looking for the woman who manages my son's care," he said. His voice was low and even with a very faint trace of something. Not quite an accent, more like a cadence. The specific rhythm of someone who thinks in more than one language. Bettina pointed to Sloane. The man turned. His eyes were extraordinarily dark, and they moved over her with the quick, comprehensive assessment of someone who was used to making fast evaluations of strangers. Sloane had the strange feeling of being catalogued. "You're the aide who's been staying after your checks with Theo," he said. It was not a question. "I check on all my patients," Sloane said carefully. "The pudding cups," he said. She said nothing. Her heart was doing something irregular behind her sternum. "My name is Cassian Mercer," he said. "Theo is my son." She had not known his surname. She had not known who he was. She learned in the next 48 hours, in the way one learns things that change the shape of a room permanently, that Cassian Mercer was the majority owner of Mercer Group, a private holding company with ports, logistics contracts, and interests she was not given a clear account of, across 4 provinces and 2 states. He was also, she would understand later, a man who occupied the space between the legal economy and something older and more dangerous with such ease that most people never knew the geography existed. What she knew that afternoon, standing at the nursing station with 4 men in dark clothing behind him, was only that he was Theo's father and that she had not made a mistake and that he was looking at her like she was a problem he hadn't anticipated. "You threatened my employee," he said. "I told him that if he didn't lower his voice, I would be documenting the interaction and reporting it to patient relations." Sloane said, "That's not a threat. That's a process." One of the men behind him shifted. Cassian raised one hand slightly, without looking back, and the man stilled. "My son drew you a picture," Cassian said. "He draws pictures for several of the staff." This was not strictly true, but it felt important to say. "He doesn't," Cassian said flatly. "He hasn't drawn anything for anyone in 8 months. He paused. The pause had weight to it. "He hasn't communicated meaningfully with anyone except me in 8 months. Sloane looked at him toward room 317. "Then whatever I'm doing," she said quietly, "I'd prefer to keep doing it, if it's helping him." Cassian Mercer studied her for a long moment with those unreasonably dark eyes. Then he said, "We're having this conversation somewhere that isn't a corridor." The family consultation room was small. There were 2 chairs, a box of tissues on a side table that Sloane had never once seen anyone use, and a print on the wall of a lighthouse that she had always thought was meant to be comforting and wasn't quite. Cassian sat in one chair. He did not invite her to sit, but she sat anyway because she had been on her feet for 7 hours and was not going to perform deference in her own workplace. He looked at her for a moment as if recalibrating slightly. Then he leaned back and crossed one ankle over his knee with the ease of a man who was comfortable in any room he occupied. "Theo's mother died 14 months ago," he said. His voice was entirely level. "Her name was Genevieve. She had a condition that was managed until it wasn't." Sloane kept her face still. She said nothing. "Theo was with her when she died," Cassian continued. "They were in her car. She lost consciousness at the wheel. He was in the back seat." A pause. "They were found 45 minutes later. He was 8 months past his 6th birthday." The fluorescent light hummed. Sloane thought about Theo's hands, always pressed flat against whatever surface was nearest, as though bracing. "He hasn't spoken since," Cassian said, "outside of me. He spoke to me twice in the weeks after, and then nothing. The psychologists say it's selective mutism stemming from the acute trauma event, which tells me nothing I couldn't have determined myself." The flatness in his voice was not coldness. It was the particular exhaustion of someone who had been given competent explanations that failed to help. "Why Halifax?" Sloane asked. "You're from Toronto, your company is." "Because Halifax is where my sister lives," he said. "Because Theo needed something that didn't look like his regular life. Because the consultant I trust most for pediatric respiratory cases is here. And because—" He stopped. "Because," she said, "because I needed to be somewhere that my regular complications couldn't follow as easily." He looked at her directly. "Anyway, 3 weeks ago, someone sent something through a ventilation system in my vehicle. It wasn't serious. It was meant as a message." His jaw tightened, barely perceptibly. "Theo was not in the vehicle, but he was nearby enough that it frightened him. He was already in a fragile state. His lungs gave out 2 days later." Sloane thought about the strange circumstances on Theo's admission. The missing surname. The large guard outside the door. The man outside his room, she said. "Not my employee," Cassian said. "That's what I came to tell the floor manager. He was placed there by someone in my organization that I no longer trust. He has been removed." Sloane felt something cold move through her stomach. "Removed," she repeated. "From his position," Cassian said, and something in his voice suggested he was aware of how that word sounded. "He's been detained for questioning. Alive, to be clear." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the steadiness of a man who had learned very long ago to hold eye contact while saying difficult things. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to understand that you are free to say no, that saying no will have no consequences for you, and that I'm asking because my son colored in 3 full pages of his sketchbook yesterday for the first time in 8 months after you sat with him for 11 minutes. Sloane waited. "I would like to hire you," Cassian said. "Not as a nurse. As Theo's full-time companion and care coordinator. You would move with us to a secure residence. You would manage his daily routine, his therapeutic schedule, the ordinary parts of his life that I—" He stopped again. "That I am not equipped to provide adequately." "You mean you want me to be his nanny?" Sloane said. "I mean I want you to be the person he's decided to trust," Cassian said, "since he seems to have made that decision without consulting me." Sloane looked at the lighthouse print. She thought about her brother Kieran, who was 23, and working a cash-in-hand job and making choices that she spent a significant portion of her mental energy worrying about. She thought about her father's credit card debt that she was technically responsible for since the estate settled. She thought about the fact that her landlord had raised her rent twice in 12 months. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "I know your legal name is Sloane Merritt, that you completed your personal support worker certification at NSCC 4 years ago, that your brother Kieran Merritt received a conditional discharge 18 months ago for a minor offense, which appears to be an isolated incident, that your late father left a debt of approximately $62,000, and that you have not taken a vacation day in 14 months. He said this evenly, without apology. I know what I need to know. The cold feeling in her stomach intensified, but it wasn't purely fear. There was something else mixed in. Anger, maybe. The particular anger of having your privacy treated as a reasonable resource by someone with more power than you. "That's an invasion of my privacy," she said. "Yes," he said simply. "And you're sitting there telling me about it openly because you expect me to find that reassuring somehow," she said. "No," he said. "I'm telling you because I won't pretend I didn't do it. I would rather you be angry at me for the truth than comfortable with a lie." He leaned forward very slightly. "I'm asking you to come into my world, Sloane. You deserve to understand what kind of man is doing the asking." She looked at him. The anger was still there, but it had changed shape slightly. "If I say yes, his conditional discharge, the terms require him to maintain stable employment. He's struggling to find something." Cassian was quiet. "For a moment, I own 6 logistics facilities across Nova Scotia. If he's willing to work, I can arrange something with a reliable salary and terms that don't depend on whether my manager likes his face." "That's not a favor," Sloane said. "That's leverage." "It's both," he said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I would make good on it, regardless of what you decide. Your brother has nothing to do with my request." She didn't believe that entirely, but she believed enough of it. "Theo," she said, "if I say yes, he gets to decide every day whether he wants me near him. I won't be assigned to him like a piece of furniture." Something shifted in Cassian's expression, a very small thing. "Agreed," he said quietly. "And I work for Theo," she said, "not for you. If there is ever a conflict between what's good for him and what's convenient for your situation, I will not be the one who compromises." He looked at her for a long moment. "I haven't had someone say anything like that to me in a very long time," he said. "Most people in my orbit are careful about what they say." "I'm not in your orbit yet," Sloane said. That finally produced something that wasn't quite a smile, but was the ghost of one. It changed his face the way a window changes a room when someone opens it unexpectedly, a brief admission of light. "No," he said, "not yet." The residence was a large stone house on a property outside the city, set back from the road behind iron gates and a stand of mature white pines that made the whole place feel like it existed slightly outside of regular geography. It was not as large as Sloane had imagined from the car and the suit and the 4 men in dark clothing. It was imposing, but it was also, she realized as she was shown to her room, clearly a house where a child lived. There were small shoe prints on the hallway floor, imperfectly cleaned, a stuffed bear on the bench at the bottom of the stairs, a child's drawing, a simple house, a tree, a sun, taped with great care to the inside of the kitchen door at roughly knee height. Her room was on the same floor as Theo's. Her window looked out over a garden where the grass was still winter-flat and grey. The closet contained a set of clothes in her approximate size, practical and high quality. There was a phone on the desk, new, already set up with the hospital's family communication app and Kieran's number. Kieran, when she called, was stunned. "You're doing what?" he said. "Temporary care role," she said. "Outside the city. Private Sloane." "I've met the father," she said. She paused. "He's honest about what he is, which is unusual." "That's a really interesting way to say you don't know exactly what he is," Kieran said. She didn't answer that, because he was right. The first 3 days were strange in the way of all new environments. Theo arrived the day after Sloane, and the change in him when he saw her, the very small, very controlled lightening of his whole posture, was enough to make the decision feel, if not unambiguously right, then at least grounded in something real. She did not push him. She maintained the approach that had worked at the hospital. Presence without pressure, routine without rigidity, small reliable pleasures offered consistently. She sat with him while he drew. She read to him in the evenings, chapter books, slightly beyond his age, because she had noticed in the hospital that he liked to work for the meaning of things. She taught him to play rummy, because her mother had taught her, and it was the only card game she actually enjoyed. He picked it up in 2 sessions. He was very intelligent, in the way of a child who has spent a great deal of time watching the world carefully. He did not speak, but he laughed once on the 4th day at something she said about a crow she had seen in the garden. It was a short sound, quickly contained, as if he'd startled himself. But it was real. She thought about it on her way to bed that night, and had to make a conscious effort not to assign it too much significance, because she knew enough about trauma recovery to understand that progress was not linear, and the worst thing you could do was make a child feel observed in their healing. Cassian Mercer was a presence in the house the way a gravitational center is a presence, not always visible, but consistently felt. He had breakfast with Theo every morning at 7:15. He worked from a study on the ground floor and was, as far as Sloane could tell, reachable at any hour of the day by a small number of people who never quite came to the house. He ate dinner with them in the kitchen on the 4 nights per week he was home, and on those nights he was not warm, exactly, but paying a quality of attention to his son that was better than warm because it was completely unperformed. He was also, Sloane gradually understood, watching everything. She found the camera in her room by accident on the 6th day, when she was looking for the outlet to charge her phone and moved the shelf beside the desk. The small device was no larger than a thumbnail, positioned to cover the door and part of the room. She stood there for a moment. Then she carried the shelf back to its position, charged her phone, and went to find Cassian. He was in the study. She knocked, entered, and placed the camera on his desk between them. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. He didn't pretend not to know what it was. "Every room," he said, "including this one. I would have told you." "When?" she said. "When I trusted you with the reason," he said. She pulled the chair on the opposite side of the desk out and sat in it without being invited, because this was the second time she had done it, and it seemed to have become their dynamic. "Tell me now," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The man who sent the message through my vehicle's ventilation system was not an external actor. He was someone inside my organization. He has been identified. He is no longer a concern." He paused. "His associate has not been identified. His associate is still, as far as I can determine, somewhere in the household's ancillary network. Contractors, vendors, people adjacent to our lives." Sloane thought about the guard outside Theo's room. She thought about the Theo in the early days of the hospital, backed against the wall. "That's why you watch," she said. "I am looking for someone," Cassian said. "I have a partial description, a specific detail, a tattoo, visible on the forearm when the sleeve moves. An anchor, old style, the kind merchant marine workers had done in the 80s. He looked at her steadily. "I don't watch because I don't trust you, Sloane. I watch because the one person I cannot afford to miss being watching is the one closest to my son." She thought about Theo, asleep down the hallway. She thought about the drawing on the kitchen door at knee height. "He's seen something," she said slowly. "Theo, he's drawn something, hasn't he? Something you don't know how to read." Cassian was very still. "Now show me," she said. He opened the bottom drawer of the desk and took out a folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully. He unfolded it on the desk and turned it toward her. It was Theo's work, the same careful pencil lines, the same large, simple figures. It showed a house. In front of the house stood a tall figure and a smaller figure, which was clearly meant to be Theo and Cassian. But off to the side, half behind a door, there was a third figure. This one was drawn differently, with lines that went slightly over themselves, agitated, as though Theo had pressed harder on the pencil here. The third figure had one arm extended. On the forearm, Theo had drawn a small mark. Sloane leaned forward. She had spent 6 weeks watching Theo draw. She knew his shorthand. The mark wasn't abstract, it was a deliberate shape, an anchor. "He knows who it is," Sloane said. "He can't tell me," Cassian said, "or he's afraid to." Or both. They looked at each other across the desk. "There's a man who comes to service the generator," Sloane said slowly. "I've seen him twice. He wears those high-visibility vests with the long sleeves, but the second time, when he was leaning into the panel, his sleeve rode up on the right side." Cassian said, "Say it." "I didn't see a tattoo clearly," Sloane said, "but the shape of a mark, something dark, the right place on the forearm." She met his eyes. "I could be wrong." "You're not wrong," Cassian said quietly. "I've had a suspicion about the contractor for a week. I needed a second source. I needed someone with nothing at stake who would see what they actually saw and not what they were told to see." He looked at her. "You've been checking everyone's arms, since you got here, since the parking garage in February," he said. Sloane sat back. The study was quiet. Outside, the pines made the soft sound they made when the wind came off the harbor. "Is Theo safe right now?" she asked. "2 of my most trusted people are outside his room," Cassian said. "The generator contractor is currently under the impression that there is a secondary service call tomorrow morning. He will be met by people who are not servicemen." Sloane looked at her hands, then back at him. "Okay," she said. "I am going to owe you an accounting of this," Cassian said. "The whole shape of it. Not now, because it's complicated and there's a great deal of it, but soon. You have a right to it. You are in this house and you are with my son and you are owed the full truth of what you walked into." "I'll hold you to that," Sloane said. "I know you will," he said, and something in his voice suggested that this was, in fact, one of the things he was counting on. The next morning, Theo came to find her before breakfast, which he had never done. He stood in the doorway of the small sitting room off the kitchen where she'd been reading, his sketchbook tucked under his arm. He crossed the room without hesitation and sat beside her on the sofa, close enough that his shoulder was against hers. He opened the sketchbook to a fresh page. He drew quickly, with the concentrated energy he used when something mattered to him. When he turned the book for her to see, it showed 3 figures in what she recognized as the kitchen. The same tall figure, the same small figure, and a new figure with a messy bun and what she realized were meant to be her scrubs, even though she wasn't wearing them anymore. Underneath, in the large, careful letters, "I want us to stay." Sloane looked at it for a moment. Then she put her arm around his shoulders and said, "Me too, bud. Me too." He leaned into her side, the way children do when they've decided someone is safe, the way that means more than most things that are said out loud. 2 weeks later, the contractor was gone. The investigation took less time than Sloane had expected, and produced more results than she had been prepared for, which was how Cassian explained it to her, briefly, at the kitchen table after Theo was in bed, keeping the shape of it as clean as possible while not omitting the significant parts. She asked 3 questions. He answered them directly. They sat in a silence after that which was not uncomfortable. "You could have handled all of this without telling me anything," Sloane said. "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you?" He turned his coffee cup slowly between both hands. "Because Theo picked you," he said, "and Theo does not pick carelessly." He looked up. "And because you told me on the first day that you work for him, not for me. I've been thinking about that ever since." "I meant it," Sloane said. "I know you did," he said. "That's why." Theo spoke his first full sentence to Sloane on a Tuesday in April in the garden, while they were doing exactly nothing useful, sitting on an overturned crate, watching a pair of chickadees argue over the feeder Sloane had put up the week before. He said, "They're always fighting about the same spot." His voice was small and careful, like something that had been stored for a long time and was being taken out slowly to see if it still worked. Sloane said, "I know. I think the one on the left has a claim, personally." He looked at her sidelong with those grey eyes. Then he looked back at the birds and said, "I think so too." She did not make a thing of it. She understood, with the instinct of someone who had sat with enough frightened people to have learned what frightened people need, that the worst thing she could do was turn toward him in that moment, with the full weight of how much it meant. She stayed exactly where she was, looking at the birds, and they sat like that for another 20 minutes, while Theo said small, careful things about the garden and the chickadees, and whether or not the crows were smarter, and she answered him in the same quiet, ordinary way, as though this was just how things had always been. That evening, Cassian was home for dinner. Theo sat across from him and said in his new small but functional voice, "Dad, Sloane thinks the crow is probably smarter than a chickadee, but I'm not sure." Cassian Mercer, majority owner of Mercer Group, a man who had made grown executives retreat from a boardroom table simply by entering it, set down his fork and looked at his son, and Sloane watched something go through his face that she understood completely and said nothing about, because some things are private. Later, after Theo was in bed, Cassian found her in the kitchen. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, he did it himself." Sloane said, "I just stayed close enough." Cassian looked at her. "That's what I mean," he said. "The summer came in the way Halifax summers do, tentatively and then, all at once, green and salt-bright and cool enough at night to sleep well." Theo's voice grew more confident by increments, the way muscles rebuild after injury, gradually, unevenly, with setbacks, and then one day with a steadiness that had not been there before. He started meeting with a therapist on Tuesday afternoons, which he had refused categorically in the months before. He started asking questions about his mother, small questions at first, and Cassian answered them with a care that Sloane could see cost him something. She stayed. She had told herself she would stay until Theo was stable, and then she would go back to her regular life, her apartment in Dartmouth, her double shifts, her small and manageable world. But the thing about Theo was that he made staying easy, and the thing about Cassian, which she admitted to herself gradually, in the way one admits difficult things, a fraction at a time, was that she had started to understand why Theo trusted him so completely, despite everything. It was a Saturday in July when Kieran came to visit for the first time, driving a used truck that Sloane very carefully did not comment on. Theo met him at the door with the particular suspicious gravity of a child who reserves judgment, and Kieran, who had grown up with 2 sisters and had a gift for small people, sat down on the front step and said very seriously, "I hear you know everything about crows." And Theo, after a moment's assessment, said, "Pretty much, and that was that." Sloane stood in the doorway and watched them, and Cassian appeared beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without asking, which had become a habit. "Your brother is good with him," Cassian said. He's good with most people, Sloane said. He just makes bad decisions sometimes. Most people with gifts do, Cassian said. She looked at him. He was watching Theo and Kieran in the garden, his coffee in one hand, the afternoon light on the grey at his temples, and she thought that for a man who spent his life managing very large, very serious problems, he looked, in that particular moment, almost like someone who was not managing anything at all. Cassian, she said. He looked at her. When you offered me this, she said. You said Theo had decided to trust me. You said you were keeping me because I was the only variable you knew wasn't compromised. Yes, he said. Is that still what I am to you, she said. A variable. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was doing something. No, he said, it isn't. She looked out at the garden, where Theo had now produced his sketchbook from somewhere and was showing Kieran something with great seriousness. Okay, she said. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not urgently. The way people do things in the middle of ordinary afternoons that turn out to matter afterward. Just a quiet, certain thing she let him. Theo noticed, at dinner, the way observant children notice things, with a sideways look and a careful expression. Then he reached for his glass of water with great studied nonchalance. But later, when he said goodnight, he hugged Sloane with both arms instead of one, which was new, and said into her shoulder, Yeah, Sloane said. I'm staying. He nodded against her shoulder with the deeply satisfied air of someone whose plan had come together. The pudding cup drawing was on the refrigerator by then, moved from Sloane's room to the kitchen at Theo's instruction, beside the drawing of the house and the tree and the sun. One morning in August, she came down to find a new one had appeared overnight, taped carefully at the edge. 3 figures, the tall man, the woman with the messy bun, the small boy. Underneath, family. Sloane made coffee and stood there for a long time, looking at it, while the early morning came in through the kitchen window and the chickadees argued outside, same as always. Some things, she thought, you don't plan. Some things arrive because you showed up for work at 11 p.m. and heard a small sound in a quiet hallway and followed it. And that is why she had never once regretted the pudding cups.